Now, with so much dysfunction in D.C. and so much opposition when it comes to the president's agenda and signature program, it's easy to think that the nation has entered some kind of uncharted political territory. And I've been as guilty as anybody of it, saying we've never been here before. But if you look back, we have had many rough patches in American history. The challenges for this president are not totally unique. In fact, there is a lot of similarity to another president, and a popular one, and he also comes from the state of New York, doesn't he?
The last one to have been elected from the state of New York, although Governor Cuomo no doubt hoping differently. That president is Franklin D. Roosevelt, the only president to win election 4 times, and thanks to a constitutional amendment, the only one who ever will. With the shutdown over, FDR's library and home in Hyde Park is back open. It's a great way to learn more about the challenges that he faced and overcame that sound so familiar and so similar to the presidential problems of today. Recently, I spoke with David Wolner. He's the resident historian and senior fellow for the Roosevelt Institute. David, it's interesting, with all of the talk about the current issues in Washington, we hear things like job killer, socialism, and the progress of a great country. Quotes that are being used today, but these are also quotes that were used against some of the proposals of Franklin Roosevelt, weren't they?
Yeah, the country was, as you know, in extremely dire straits in the early 1930s, and Franklin Roosevelt was determined to use the power of government to try to right the economy and get people back to work. He was also trying to figure out a way to provide the American people with a kind of level of security, and pieces of legislation like Social Security that we now take for granted were shouted down by conservative critics in the New Deal. In fact, the American Liberty League said that the passage of the Social Security Act meant the end of democracy.
Looking at it in 2013, it feels like FDR was more successful than Barack Obama is today. Was he more successful? Did he have the same kind of resistance in the 30s that Obama has today?
Well, I think you're right. President Roosevelt was more successful in the early 30s, but we have to take into consideration the context in which he was working. First of all, the economic system in the country had virtually collapsed. The free market system had collapsed. And the country was in such dire straits that the people were demanding action, and action now, as he said in his first inaugural. President Roosevelt also had a much different makeup in Congress. You know, his strongest critics were conservative Democrats. Some of his strongest supporters were liberal Republicans. So the mix-up in Congress and the party makeup was quite different. And I think it was a healthier makeup, actually. And so he was able to get through an amazing number of pieces of legislation, even in his first 100 days.
How did President Roosevelt handle his critics? I'm wondering if perhaps there are any lessons that our current president could learn from FDR.
Well, I think one of the biggest differences is that Franklin Roosevelt was not afraid to identify the forces of opposition, to acknowledge those forces, to identify them, and frankly, to attack them. He as far as he was concerned, the forces of wealth and privilege had essentially brought the country to ruin in 1933, between 1929 and 1933. They were the ones who were responsible for the economic collapse, and he wasn't afraid to point that out. And essentially, you know, he asked the American people to join with him in using the government to try to create an economic system that was more just, more equitable, and ultimately more economically sustainable.
Was that the sales pitch that President Roosevelt used for Social Security, one of his major social civic achievements, trying to compare that again to what President Obama has been doing with health care reform? Well,
you know, time and time again, Franklin Roosevelt, from his first inaugural address right up through the 36 election, you know, he really went on the attack in many ways. I mean, he basically convinced the American people that the forces of what he called economic tyranny were there to try to stifle any attempt at serious reform. And of course, with millions of people out of work, millions of people suffering, in fact, it's estimated that when he took office, about 20% of the American population was facing serious malnutrition. In those kinds of economic circumstances, you know, the people were desperate to see the government act, and it did act. And part of what he tried to do was to make it clear that the economic structure, the inequality that had existed in this Gilded Age that we've been living through, was simply not sustainable. You had to make some structural reforms. And so Social Security was there to provide a measure of economic security, social justice, economic security for the aged and for the unemployed.
Finally, you talked about getting the government to act, and government had to act. Today we're dealing with government inaction. Did Roosevelt ever face, or can you ever recall, a period where there was a party that seemed to be so willing to jeopardize national interest for the sake of political gain like we're seeing today?
No, there are parallels. The American Liberty League is very similar to the harsh critics on the right, the Tea Party critics of Barack Obama. The American Liberty League said that Roosevelt was taking the country down to socialism or fascism, that he was running against the American Constitution. But Roosevelt essentially made a mockery of these folks. He pointed out that the Liberty League was financed mostly by DuPont money and wealthy corporate interests, and was really able to win over the popular sentiment, which was that the American people were desperate. The economic system that they've been living under wasn't working, and Franklin Roosevelt essentially put the government to work to make capitalism help provide for the average American. He wasn't against capitalism. He saved capitalism.
That's a history lesson we could certainly use, and particularly in Washington. David Wolner, Senior Fellow, Resident Hyde Park Historian for the Roosevelt Institute. David, always a pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you, Andrew.
And just an interesting side note, one of FDR's chief critics, especially on Social Security, was a group called the John Birch Society. It's founded by Fred Koch, the father of Charles and David Koch, the Koch brothers, who we hear about so much today in today's politics.
Wow. Andrew, we did a couple weeks ago, we just ran quotes on there. And you would have sworn we just took them out of the headlines from that morning or from the day before for somebody in the Tea Party.
The dawn of socialism
right.
will destroy freedom.
Exactly, an attack on capitalism,
right.
all the rest. They were, back then, when he was talking about Social Security, they were against what LBJ tried to do with Medicare. We've heard this story before. Now, this does not excuse the rollout here of Obamacare, which has been, to say, riddled with problems is putting it very politely.
The websites were better in the 60s.
Yeah, exactly. The websites were better. But you look in history, it is eerie how identical the same criticisms have been. And I think that might be some of what's driving, not for all of them, but for some of the critics, they're afraid this thing's going to be just as popular as Medicare and Social Security.
And that split, that division, predates FDR. You can go back to Teddy Roosevelt, when you had the days of progressives and conservatives. And today, I mean, we have Republicans and Democrats, we have liberals and conservatives, but you still have progressives and conservatives. There always seemed to be a group looking to advance things,
but now it's divided solely in one party versus another.
That's true. That's true, and that was a great point that David Wolner made, that liberal Republicans were aiding President Roosevelt, and conservative Democrats were his chief opponent. It was more regional than it was party affiliated.
It also made it more fun. I mean, the idea that a Jacob Javits, for example, right, that you had a Republican like Javits, the idea that that's even conceivable now is just such a, that's impossible. You could have a liberal Republican, and forget about moderate. He was liberal. You covered him, right? Mm-hmm. It's just of a bygone era. But
there was this notion of government as a force for good, that government can help people and help the country, and that seems to be under assault today also. And I get the feeling that all of us at the table believe the government is an instrument of good.
It can be, but I tell you the big thing, and this will make me unpopular for saying it. I knew from my grandparents' generation, and my grandfather, he drove a bus and a trolley. It's not like he read the paper every day. Everybody blames the political parties. There has to be some self-accountability in the public too, and I run into this, which is people will know this much about something, and it'll come from some slanted perspective on either side. And then that's all they think is their responsibility. Mm-hmm. We, the people, have a little bit of a job here to figure out what's BS and what's real too. And I think the public sometimes scapegoats everybody else instead of taking a look in the mirror. I think
that doesn't apply to your listening audience.
Absolutely not. Look at what they're watching. But my point is, this too. People will believe, a canard without a second thought.
If it's in the internet, they believe it, and then the press will ask me as a candidate to respond to something that one person said, and I say, come on. why are you asking me this question?
Oh, the silliness with, look how much time we wasted as a country about whether or not the president was from Kenya, right? Mm-hmm. Remember that, right? Or if he was a Muslim or whatever else. And bless at least McCain for talking to that woman that one time. But other than him, the thing festered, all the wasted time and stories and Donald Trumps of the world, and right? I mean, some of that goes to the viewing public and to the public who don't read anymore. And I don't know. I think there's a cause and effect. All right. You've heard of the most interesting man in the world here, Dos Equis. Well, we will also focus on the most interesting man, at least on the panel. When we come back, we'll... Yeah, no. I've been meaning to do this for a while. Chris Shay's not only one of our fans. Yeah, you see that? He assumed it was him. We'll be talking a little bit about Mr. Shay's after this.